Hey, all. So we're going to talk about carbon cap and trade, and this is actually similar to a carbon tax in many ways, but we'll see that there's some pretty important differences. So essentially, what happens in the case of cap and trade is the government issues carbon permits. We'll talk about how they issue them, but essentially, the number of permits issued caps the overall emissions for the entire industry. So in this case, that's the cap, right? The number of permits issued. And for each, let's just, again, just using round numbers, let's say for each ton of carbon, you have to have one permit to spend to emit that ton. Now, if you emit and you don't have the permit for that, obviously, and you get caught, that's another part, enforcement. You would likely have to pay a fine that maybe it would have to be a number more than the permit, right? So, twice the value of a permit or something like that. If you don't need all the permits that you have, so let's say, kind of harkening back to our early example, let's say the permits are $4. If there's a few things you can do to reduce your CO2 that are cheaper than the permit, then you're actually going to have extra permits left. And what you can do at that point is you can then sell them to other places that can't necessarily do the same work that you did. They can't make their system run more efficiently as cheaply as you did, so you actually are incentivized because now you can sell these permits. So built into this is the notion that as the government issues these permits, like the first time we're starting this, everyone gets the permits and they cover their CO2 that they emit, but that total number of permits can actually be reduced in a set schedule. Like every couple of years, there's fewer and fewer and fewer permits, and what that does is it drives up the price that you can sell the permit if you're auctioning it off to a different company. And you had invested to not need all the permits that you have, but the other companies, well, it's going to cost them a lot more. You can actually sell your permit at an elevated cost, which provides a revenue stream. So you can actually make money on this deal as a utility. So the big question in the case of cap and trade, or the big kind of sticking point, is actually how the permits are given out, right? So we talked about how the government could say, okay, we're going to issue 500 permits this year, 500 tons of carbon. Numbers are way higher than that, but helps us wrap our head around it. Now, what do, right? Do they sell those permits to each company based on the amount of CO2 that they emit? Do they give those permits away? And those are kind of the two primary competing methods. Is do we just give them all away to the companies and it's essentially free, and then if the company is selling it, they're actually making a profit on those? Or do they have to buy the permits at an auction price from the government? And in that case, it's actually more similar to a carbon tax. You'd have to buy X number of permits. But if your CO2 is reduced, you'd actually have to buy fewer permits rather than getting all the permits at once. So when we look at industries like carbon-intensive industries like coal, for example, people in the coal industry obviously would choose to be given permits and then have to buy a few more. You're allotted some amount. They'd probably have to buy some more, but they could buy those from other industries that weren't using as much. So again, you can see that there's a lot of moving parts here. One of the interesting things to think about is the companies that have to buy more permits, whether they were given some and they have to buy more in addition, or if they had to buy all of them, whether we auction them or give them away, that actually drives up that user's end cost, right? So that power would be more expensive. So the coal industry, for example, the coal power itself would cost more. And then we start to actually can kind of open the gates on free market capitalism. And so if that type of power actually just costs more, then people are going to choose alternate forms of energy, right? So it actually creates an incentive. So again, there's a lot to think about here. So if you are asking companies to buy more permits to make their product more expensive, and sell less of their product so people kind of choose a different route, you're not going to get much buy-in from those industries, because we have a government system that's set up with lobbyists, and all of these politicians have multiple $1 million people talking in their ears telling them to do different things. This isn't really very attractive unless there's some sort of financial benefit for the company. So when you think about these companies that would be pretty turned off by having to pay and initially drive up their cost, they would prefer for them to be given out, right? So you would get some set amount, and those industries or those users that can reduce, they're going to make their profit. But one of the things that could be thought about is that if people were given more, they could actually sell those and use those profits essentially as like a financial aid system to further reduce CO2. So the next year when the permits come out and they may have a higher price, you have to buy fewer and fewer and fewer of them. So they can provide like an internal revenue stream that can actually allow them to produce less CO2 in the future. So when we look at policies that we've talked about, so we don't have either of these. We don't have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. If we look at the ideas that have been considered, the one that's really gained the most, what we would call bipartisan buy-in, right? So both sides of the political spectrum, is actually initially giving them out. So starting the system, here's all the carbon credits, here you go, everyone's got as much carbon as you need, then the next year it's a little bit reduced, and then the next year it's a little bit reduced. But not only does that reduce over time, the percentage of them given away actually reduces. And then over the long term, maybe 20, 25, 30 years, that transitions from giving them all out to auctioning them all off. And so these users would have, a couple of decades to actually get all the way down to the point where they're not having to pay auction cost or market cost for those permits when the time comes. So when we compare the two, they're pretty similar in the big picture since they kind of do the same thing. So if you remember in the carbon tax, the plant would reduce CO2 until the marginal cost of that CO2 reduction was smaller than the tax benefit, right? So we modeled it, two different plants that had two different marginal costs of increasing efficiency. So whether the marginal cost gets down to greater than the cost of the tax, or in the other case, greater than the cost of the permit, at that point you'd stop innovating. And potentially the tax could go up, right? Then as the tax is raised or the other aspects are raised, it could, again, drive that emission down a little bit further. The other thing to think about is both of them actually transfer a significant amount of wealth from the utilities to the government, which you could kind of think about. Ultimately, it's not coming from the utilities, it's coming from the user, right? So both of them lead to a higher user cost for energy, and that money ends up in the bank account of the government. And so as I talked about before, there's lots of different things. There's even a notion of what we call cap and dividend, where everyone gets a carbon check. But again, there's lots of other things we could do with that. So another thing that they have in common, which is actually a pretty big benefit, that each company in both model is actually pushed towards innovation, right? We always talk about, necessity is the mother of invention. So and humans are clever, right? We're smart. We can figure different things out. And so as these prices become more and more daunting, the research and development in producing less and less CO2 is increased. So it has a pretty substantial benefit on both sides, but they do also have some interesting problems that we'll talk about. So in our neat little factories, Factory A and Factory B, we talked about marginal cost. Factory A had a fairly low marginal cost, right? $1, $2, $3, diminishing returns. Factory B had a higher marginal cost, $2, $4, $6, $8. And we saw how that played out. But that's a model, right? Like that's a model saying we know what marginal costs are. The reality is you don't really know what it's going to cost until you start the project. Like costs tend to climb, or sometimes things are cheaper than you thought. Sometimes things are more expensive than you thought. So it's a pretty big guess as to what the marginal cost is. And so we don't really know what we're going to see for carbon reduction. So with the carbon tax, we can actually think about it as a beer run or a soda run if you don't want beer. That's up to you. But in the case of a carbon tax, we know what the tax is, but we don't know what the impacts are going to be, right? So we pass the hat around, everyone puts in some cash, and we come up with $50, right? And we send one of our friends to the store, and we say, get as much beer as you can get with $50. And they come back, and they don't bring very much beer back, or they bring a whole bunch of beer back. You don't really know what you're going to get because you don't know what the price is going in, right? So that's the problem with carbon taxes. You don't know the results you're going to have, but you know what the finances are, right? You know what the tax is going to be. In the case of cap and trade, it's actually the opposite problem. We can still do the beer run analogy. So let's say you're sitting around and you say, okay, we need 8 6-packs of beer. We like craft beer. It's not so cheap. And so we send someone to the store and say, get 8 6-packs of beer. They get there. They might find that they don't know what that's going to cost. They don't have enough money to cover it. Or maybe they have way too much money to cover it and it didn't optimize the value, right? So both of those kind of have those similar problems, right? One, you know how much cash you have going in, but you don't know what the impact is going to be. The other, you know what the impact is going to be, but you don't know how much it's going to cost. So both of those, both of those are actually a little bit overblown. They can be reduced by this notion of incremental increase, right? So you could start by overissuing permits, then you have as much as you need, and then that can be reduced over time. So, and again, one of the biggest things to think about is that really, and in a sad way, both of these in the United States are a political death wish, right? From whatever side you're on. So the chance that we will see a carbon cap and trade system is pretty low. We have a lot of powerful lobbying organizations that have a lot to lose, that represent a lot of people that are making profit, producing CO2. And carbon tax, everyone hates taxes, right? And again, that tax is going to be passed on to the user. In both cases, it comes down to us. And nobody wants to pay more. I mean, we've seen that as gas prices rise and fall. Even if it's an incremental cost, gas prices go up, 15 cents a gallon. It's actually not that much more. It might cost you $5 more to fill up. But people freak out at that, right? Like, we hate that. And so neither of these really have a great political future unless we really have the national will. The EU, so the European Union, has had a carbon cap and trade system in place for quite a long time. It's effective. It probably could be more effective, but also the cool thing about that is that there's a little bit of a roadmap. So it's not making this up from scratch. We can actually see how it's been done, and what parts of it could use kind of tweaking or modifying. So this is what I call the Patagonia approach, right? So voluntary or transparency. And essentially for this, in this case, it's almost like peer pressure, right? So the emissions standards of any company or industry or kind of sub-organization within that information then goes on a carbon registry, and a user, us, we can go on and kind of look at, okay, well, this company is doing this much, this company is doing that much, and they would potentially be embarrassed because they're emitting far more pollution than other companies. And some of that I think would work to a degree, but for that to work, you have to have people making those decisions really value a reduced carbon industry. So most people don't value a reduced carbon industry. Most people value money, right? And so if you present someone with 4 choices of a power company and one of them, has 10% of the emissions of the others, yet it costs more, most people are going to just go with what's most affordable, right? So most companies are going to go with or most people are going to go with the cheapest option. Some that maybe are fairly wealthy, and they don't have to worry about kind of bottom line living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe they can actually install their virtue and buy clean power. But that's not really an option for everyone. So the notion of voluntary or transparency as a method to reduce CO2 could be useful, right? Like that's information that I feel like we should have as consumers, but its capacity to reduce kind of large scale CO2, it's probably not there. So those are the kind of financial policies that we've kind of built in to get out of this failure of the free market. So remember, we talked about market failure. And because we have these externalities, we have these outside impacts that companies don't necessarily pay for. That's what we're trying to solve with these policies, right? So the fact that you could emit as much CO2 as you want and not pay an additional price, that's not going to work, right? That's not going to work going forward. So we have to develop some way to fill in those gaps, right? So just to kind of reiterate, we talked about kind of conventional regulation, setting a limit. You can't produce beyond this. Cars must get 50 miles to the gallon. Every car company has to make 2 EVs or something like that. And then we talked about really getting into the financial side of things by looking at a carbon tax, which again, you are taxed by unit of CO2 you emit. Cap and trade. So cap and trade is a little bit different because it actually can provide a revenue stream for those that are the lowest emitters, right? So you have to buy fewer permits, or you can sell your permits and get some of your money back. And then again, voluntary or transparency, right? Where you just make sure that everybody knows how much each individual organization is producing as emission, and just let that be public information and let the chips fall. So again, I always kind of think that there's a lot of interplay, right? So the reality is we can kind of put all of this together, right? So we can have conventional regulations, whether we do carbon tax or cap and trade. We've explored that, but also I think that we should have the information. It's not necessarily always useful, right? Like I pay Idaho Power for my power bill every year. I don't really have a choice, right? Really, my only personal choice is to spend $15,000 and put in some solar panels, right? So I don't necessarily have a purchase choice. So I could look at the information on, of how Idaho Power emits emissions, but I don't really have a choice that I could make. So it would definitely have limited impact. All right. Well, that's going to finish it up for this module, and I'll check you later.